Around this time, I was still very much struggling with spiritual warfare and really had no idea what to think about the Bible and was consulting various peoples on the subject and trying to find out which denomination in which I seemed best to fit. Well, on the 11th of April, in the midst of myself also struggling with kicking this addiction of mine, I discovered the book, The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. I discovered this book through the videos of one Johnny Keane. He is a booktuber on here whom I shall detail later in the third act. And I had assumed that this book was sort of like a devotional non-fiction sort of a thing. You know, somebody telling how they've sinned and such, and, you know, how they've, through the graces of God, have cleaned themselves of it. Something that would be very apropos for someone like myself, who is struggling with an addiction of pornography, to read. But then I sort of read up on the book, and apparently it's not a memoir or non-fiction. It's essentially a novel, a gothic fiction novel. Now, I've discussed gothic fiction on this channel before. You could just go to my review of The Castles of Athelian and Dunbayne by Anne Radcliffe to hear my thoughts on some strata of Gothic literature. At this point, I wasn't too impressed with it at all. The only Gothic I'd read was that. So I was a bit abstemious and just went into it, hoping that, you know, I might get something out of it. Let me tell you, I believe that this book, this very novel, is the greatest piece of fiction that I have ever read. I won't give away all of the story details here. This book will definitely get its own video. But essentially, it chronicles the life of one Robert Ringham, and basically how he struggles with sin and such, because he is brought up by a Calvinistic family, and somehow thinks that his sin is justified by that, but still he goes on sinning, and he has no idea whether he's one of the elect or not. I don't believe in Calvinism at all. I think it's a very abhorrent and very wicked practice indeed. But essentially, evidently, he stumbles upon the presence of one Gil Martin, who the reader can obviously easily identify as being the devil. And basically, he declares Robert Ringham one of the elect, and says that it is his mission in his life to kill the sinners and such for the grace of God. And so he does all this, commits several crimes, thinking himself to be justified in the act of salvation. But evidently, this sort of transgresses into himself becoming rather mad and going insane, and evidently leading him down a very dark path indeed. And I read this book, and I said, oh my Lord, I do not want to end up like Ringham. No, not at all. So I decided from that day forward to not heed the words of anyone with regard to the Bible, even the words of the very dastardly and just false teacher of Jesus, Brian Denlinger, and just read the Bible for myself, as it ought to be read. And so I carried on in this way, while still trying to fight the urge of self-pollution. And I had detailed this aspect of my addiction before, but it seemed to grow ever more prevalent in my final days of it. But the effects of self-pollution on wakefulness is very, very drastic and not at all beneficial at all to your health. It is said that self-pollution basically makes you more tired. I suppose it is a release of energy, in a sense, and that is very much true. You know how I would get up in the morning, early in the morning, and pollute, and then go on my walk and such. Well, it turns out that, having gotten up at 3, polluting for a bit, walking at 4, cooling off by around 7 or 8 in the morning, I would be back in bed and I wouldn't rise until like 10 or 11, or some ridiculous hour like that. And I noticed that I didn't want to keep doing this. It was becoming ever more prevalent, and I just wanted to get up, go on my walk, without having the need to self-pollute. I was so dependent on myself, self-polluting, because it was just so addictive. It really, really was. And in the days leading up to, or in the days following myself wanting to leave this community, and in the days following myself reading Hogg's book, I noticed that I had a very bizarre, and I suppose fairly ironical, assortment of dreams over various nights. One of these dreams, I suppose, had an argument with some or another girl, and I suppose she had threatened to eat me. Not exactly sure what else happened beyond that, but I suppose that sort of symbolized my my former vor fetish and such, and it just really seemed to indicate to me how foolish and how really just unregenerate it is. And then I had another dream in which I had worshipped someone's stomach, a girl's stomach, very much, as I said, like Aaron and his peoples in Israel before they were struck down by the Lord in the sight of Moses. But and then that was also a wet dream, I must add, and so that just kind of made me think, I'm putting this above God, and I don't want to do that. I really do not want to do that. This is something, this is sin. It really is. That, and it's just ridiculous, the way it's been headed downhill consistently throughout the last few years. I just want to be free of it. Another dream of mine that I had in the succession of nights was myself in a bookshop. The very same bookshop at which I procured the Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner. The lady there, well, lady, I say lady, she's probably younger than me, had seen that I was buying this book and had had it herself. And the next day, or when I came back there, after reading the book, I told her to read it. It's the best piece of fiction I've ever read. It'll make you want to read the Bible for yourself and not follow the teachings of any of these evangelists and these false preachers. And she seemed to be very mystified by this. The dream I had was myself in that bookshop talking to this lady. And I don't know how this happened, but somehow or other my trousers were ripped off and it exposed my genitals. In the dream, mind you. And she thought this to be very humorous indeed, and I was fairly embarrassed by it. Evidently, this seemed to foreshadow myself going back to the bookshop and never seeing her presence ever again. I have been going to that bookshop now rather steadily for about 3 months, and I have yet to see her presence. Very symbolic indeed. Second to last dream I had, the penultimate dream, as you know, or you probably don't know, but in my school days I used to actually help out teachers in their classes as sort of a student aid, and I would file paperwork and such, and would even help students along with their own affairs, and would help them with homework and all that, because I seemed to be a very smart individual. And so this particular dream, I was about 17 or so at the time of the dream's occurrence, and essentially this one student, this little girl, whom I had known and really found I was indifferent towards, because at the time I was lusting after other women, as you know from the Snack and Stories. But for some reason, I can't exactly discern why, but she had promised me that she would engage in sexual intercourse, I suppose, the evening of myself helping her. And I'm not entirely sure what how the rest of that dream played out, but I presume that I was an animal, and I basically wanted to get a little, and she had denied it and such and all this, and I woke up after that. And then the last dream I had was just tending to a woman's aching stomach. And I have no explanation for that either. I presume this penultimate dream signified that, were I to keep going on with this, that I would never achieve romance in reality, and would just be stuck forever in this unending cycle of perversity and disillusion and just all this deviltry. And during this, I had noticed that, I didn't tell Mother about this, obviously, but I had noticed that whenever, I don't care what time it was, but any day, maybe within the day I had last polluted, I would notice that my hands would be injured in some way or other. My hands would either receive cuts and such, and I couldn't even reach Mother over the phone one time. It had nothing to do with my hands, I just couldn't reach her over the phone. It was just utterly unusual. But I noticed that all this stuff was going on, and did not question it at the time, but still very much wanted to clean myself of it, even though I was not very successful at all, to be frank. But nonetheless, I continued on in this way, just not at all really thinking about it, when all of a sudden I decided to look into the hymnal again. Yes, the hymn book that I had polluted with at the beginning of the month or so. And it took me about, a little while to register this. But I'll tell you now the very unusual things I had read in there at the time of myself trying to resist the urge, but evidently succumbing with it. I started reading words like Eucharist, Mass, Bishop, Confession, and all this other strange concatenation of terms. And it took only about 15 or 20 minutes for me to realize that this is Catholic. And that was why I had ejaculated. I realized that Catholicism had begat sex perversion, and that I wanted no part of it at all. Because were I to have even any evidence of myself being a former Catholic in my house, that I would just dive back into it, into lusting and such, and polluting and all this nonsense. So I decided to get rid of quite a few Catholic texts. I got rid of my catechism. I got rid of a prayer book, which didn't say it was Catholic, but really it was. It really was. And I got rid of the hymnal. The hymnal being the one that I showed off in the August book haul. And then I was still at the time following Catholic for Rednecks, because even though I was not at all a practicing Catholic, I still very much liked his views on things. And so I just decided to unsubscribe from him completely, even though he had just returned after a long hiatus. And also to delete all of the videos I had in a playlist I compiled called The Best of Catholic for Rednecks, because he was a Catholic and I didn't want anything to do with the faith, because I just knew it was going to make me lust again. And how I knew this was revealed to me when I had picked up a book called Hadrian the Seventh by Friedrich Rolf. I had showed that in my May book haul. And basically, that book involves the Catholic Church very heavily, and it does not vilify it at all. It actually glorifies it. And when I picked up this book, I was going to read it just to get it out of my sight, because I knew that I was just going to continue to lust if I continue to have this in my possession. And when I picked it up, I swear, this book was burning. It was like I picked up a hot iron or something, and I just threw it down because it nearly burned myself with it. I had no idea what to do at all. But I knew, though I was not following anyone's opinions on the Holy Scriptures, and that I was reading the Bible for myself, I knew that I had somehow to escape Catholicism. And considering that most of my family are very devout Catholics, that in itself was no easy thing to accomplish.